Governance in Europe and America is like children playing house. Recently, Europe and America have put on a show of tariff offense and defense, letting us know that a 10% tariff is nothing. When European and American politicians talk about tariffs, they aim for a 200% rate. On February 10th, Trump suddenly announced an additional 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum products imported into the United States. At the same time, he cancelled the tariff exemptions previously granted to some allies for steel and aluminum products, and announced that this policy would take effect on March 12. When signing the document, Trump stated that this move would help bring the steel and aluminum industries and lost jobs back to the United States. There will be no exceptions or exemptions for the tariffs, regardless of their origin. Trump's senior advisor on trade and manufacturing, Navarro, stated that steel and aluminum tariffs 2.0 will eliminate foreign dumping, promote domestic production, and ensure that our steel and aluminum industries become the backbone and pillar industries of the U.S. economy and national security. China is the world's leading producer of steel and aluminum. China's steel production is 55% of the global total, and aluminum production is 59%, 10 times that of India, second largest producer. Trump imposed a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum products imported into the United States, although it was said to be a tax increase on countries. Since more than half of the world's steel and aluminum products are produced in China, and over 40% of the exported products are Chinese goods, Trump's policy seems a disguised measure against China. The United States indeed does not produce much steel and aluminum, and imports a significant amount annually. But this policy is not really aimed at China. It is intended to support the U.S. steel and aluminum industries and increase American production capacity. The U.S. has long imposed various invisible barriers on steel and aluminum products far beyond just tariffs. Currently, the U.S. does not import much steel and aluminum from China, according to data. In 2023, imported steel products accounted for 23% of U.S. steel consumption. The largest sources of imports are Canada, Brazil, Mexico, South Korea, and Vietnam, with aluminum having a similar proportion. These are all American products. The fact that the US prefers to import steel and aluminum products from Vietnam rather than China indicates that it has nothing to do with tariffs. The US has long stopped purchasing Chinese steel and aluminum products, so this new US policy has no impact on China. China's Ministry of Commerce has only issued a mild objection. This is based on official import data. Because steel and aluminum don't have labels, finished can easily be sold as semi-finished. For example, can you tell which is from China or Vietnam? As indistinguishable, once these rebar are mixed and loaded onto a ship, the origin becomes unclear. The fact that there appears to be no import of steel and aluminum from China doesn't mean there aren't any actual imports. The United States neither plans to nor has the capability to invent a high-tech method to find the origin of steel and aluminum. Moreover, Trump's goal is to support the production of steel and aluminum within the United States, not to suppress China. Therefore, Trump's steel and aluminum policy this time is like a blanket attack, broadly imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum products from all countries, including allies. The United States buys the most steel and aluminum from Canada, so Canada's reaction was the most intense. Canada doesn't have many cards to play, but this time it played a card that crossed the line, which is it announces a 25% tariff on electricity exported from Canada to the United States to offset Trump-caused losses. Canada is vast, rich in resources, and has low-cost hydroelectric power. The US buys much of its electricity from Canada. Electricity is a special commodity because electricity cannot be stored. The input and output of the entire power grid must be exactly equal at every moment, otherwise the grid will collapse. Therefore, the main function of the power grid is to find ways to constantly adjust the input and output. For modern society, electricity is rigid, like food in agriculture. For a stable power grid, if a large portion of the electricity supply suddenly increases in price, you can only agree temporarily. Otherwise, you would have to let your factories or residents go without electricity, or your power grid would collapse instantly, causing greater losses than the bill. All of this can only be resolved once you find a new source of electricity supply. This is a very lengthy construction process. Therefore, electricity supply is the lifeline of a modern nation and must be firmly held in one's own hands without giving others any opportunity to extort. Similarly, only countries that trust each other immensely can engage in cross-border electricity procurement. Purchasing electricity from another country is often a token of trust. In many international negotiations, this is a significant bargaining chip. The United States entrusting its electricity lifeline to Canada is a sign of trust. But now, Canada is using electricity supply to threaten the United States, which is crossing a line. On March 10, Ontario Premier Doug Ford stated in a declaration that if the trade war continues, he will not hesitate to increase charges or even completely cut off electricity exports to the United States. Regarding Canada's threat to raise charges or even cut off electricity exports to the US, Trump was furious, calling Canada a tariff abuser and accusing Canada of long-term tariff abuse to oppress the United States, claiming he was merely forced to retaliate. Trump announced an additional 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. This means imposing a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, effective immediately on March 12th. In the face of Trump's threat, Canada did not back down at all, announcing at 11 a.m. on March 11th that if the U.S. implemented the 50% tariff, it would cut off power supply to states like New York and Michigan. Subsequently, Trump sent Commerce Secretary Lighthizer to negotiate with Canada, threatening. After the talks, Canada backed down, initially ready to cut off power to the U.S. Canada announced on March 11th that it would suspend the imposition of additional fees on electricity exported to the U.S., while Trump stated that on March 12th he would not impose the 50% tariff on Canada. The steel and aluminum tariffs would only be set at 25%. The U.S. and Canada engaged in an extreme game of brinkmanship, from nuclear threats to rapid, elegant negotiations, as if governing large nations was child's play. Although Canada backed down on using electricity as leverage against the U.S. in this boundary-pushing behavior, it did not back down. In the overall tariff war, March 12th, Canada announced a 25% reciprocal counter-tariff on 29.8 billion CAD worth of U.S. goods, in response to the U.S. imposing a 25% tariff on all imported steel and aluminum, effective March 13th. Canada opted for reciprocal countermeasures, while the EU chose to impose excessive countermeasures. This time, the EU presented a long list, announcing additional tariffs on US products worth 26 billion euros. The EU's countermeasure is severe, as the EU's exports of steel and aluminum to the US do not amount to 26 billion euros. This is a strategic move, initiating a tariff war against the US, allowing Trump, who is accustomed to using tariffs to pressure others, to experience what it's like to be pressured by others. In 2018, Trump attempted to impose tariffs on the EU's steel and aluminum products, and the EU was ready to counter with tariffs. After negotiations, the two sides reached a settlement. The US allows the EU to export 3.3 million tons of steel and 384,000 tons of unwrought aluminum to the US, annually tariff-free, with tariffs on excess. This tax-free quota was completely cancelled by Trump this time, effectively raising the tariffs on EU exports of steel and aluminum products to the US from 0% directly to 25%. So the EU was in an uproar. However, the competitiveness of EU steel and aluminum products is not strong. Although the US granted the EU a bunch of tax-free quotas, the EU never fully utilized these quotas. According to 2022 data, the EU did use up the quota mentioned earlier. But outside of the quota, there was basically no export of steel to the US. And the aluminum quota wasn't even fully used. They couldn't sell it even with zero tariffs. Based on the current prices of steel and aluminum, even if the EU fully utilized its quota, the value of the goods would only be about $5 billion. However, this time the EU imposed tariffs on US products worth 26 billion euros, with a value close to $30 billion. This is a six-fold punishment directly aimed at the US, and it's a targeted precision strike, with nearly $30 billion hitting Trump's warm voter base. The EU listed two sets of items, with the first targeting American bourbon whiskey, produced in Kentucky, Harley-Davidson motorcycles from Wisconsin, and American jeans, among other politically symbolic goods. These are the pride of the rednecks, and on a larger scale, even the pride of America. In a certain sense, Harley-Davidson motorcycles can partially represent the American spirit. The EU announced an additional 50% tariff on goods worth a total of 8 billion euros. The second list, targeting agricultural products like beef from Texas and dairy from Wisconsin, amounts to a total value of 18 billion euros. All of these are from Trump's core voter base. The retaliatory tariffs are set to be implemented in mid-April, with specific rates to be announced later. Because of Trump's reckless actions, the US was hit with a 50% tariff, and it was on American products like whiskey, Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and jeans, imposed by an ally like the EU. The entire US was instantly in an uproar. Trump was also furious. On March 13, Trump announced that he would. A 200% tariff will be imposed on the EU, that's right. The figure reported externally is 200%. At the same time, Trump also announced that the organization that abuses tariffs the most in the world is no longer Canada, but the EU, which was established solely to take advantage of the United States. It turns out that the US has always been taken advantage of by the EU. Looking back, Trump also said that the US has always been taken advantage of by Canada and Mexico. Further back, Trump said that the US has always been taken advantage of by China, Japan, South Korea, and others. After World War II, the United States painstakingly and at great expense established global rules and spent enormous amounts annually on military deployments worldwide to maintain these rules, which apparently was mainly to let others take advantage of itself. How could Trump say something breaking intelligence limits? From the announcement to a 25% tariff on EU steel and aluminum products, to the EU imposing a 50% tariff on the US that same day. Then the next day, a 200% tariff was imposed on the EU, all within just 24 hours. The tariff rate went from 0% to 25%, then to 50%, and then to 200%. Who says the administrative efficiency of the Western democratic system is low? The efficiency of imposing tariffs is so high, it's off the charts. Announcing tariff rates like this is purely chaotic shouting. It's meaningless, and such chaotic shouting cannot be casually laughed off afterward. If you shout it enough times, the false becomes true. Once American rednecks get used to tariff quotes of 50% to 200%, if you don't charge according to that, it's considered treason. The trigger for the Great Depression in the last century was the United States first launching a tariff war against Europe, using tariff barriers to block European products from entering, which led to brutal retaliation from Europe and ultimately caused economic collapse in all countries. The US was the first to recover from that Great Depression because it was the world's leading industrial nation at the time. Trump wants to replicate all of this to restore America's greatness. But is the US still the world's leading industrial nation today?